I'm going to talk about oyster restoration as community rehabilitation. So this is a little bit of the outline. So background, who am I? Why am I talking to you today? What is my perspective? And then some health and well-being about what bringing people to coastal environments does for their health and well-being. It can provide community and environmental restoration. It allows people to rediscover their community knowledge. It deepens the neighborhood engagement, and it has really profound effects on their health, both mental and physical health. And then using that bridge to hopefully have given you some credibility in myself and then told you why we should think about this subject, I'm going to give you some ideas about ways to implement it. What I'm really trying to do here is bridge two interdisciplinary subjects, urban planning and environmental restoration. And so this is the About Me section. I used to do a lot of environmental restoration in California. For 7 years, I worked on one of the most protected rivers in California, bringing salmon, native salmon, back up to spawn and rear and spend their life cycle in the river, which was in an urban setting. It was in Sacramento, the capital of California. And that work won our organization the highest award in California for environmental management. I ended up restoring 22 acres of habitat, developed incredibly robust data sets using otolith data, and we measured it through time, multiple years. I think they're going on almost 10 years of this data. And I was also serving as a park commissioner for Sacramento County, which oversaw about 15,000 acres of parkland for 1.5 million people. And we were thinking about how do we make sure that this park is accessible to everyone and that everyone can enjoy the park and the park is being maintained in an environmentally sustainable way. And through these two different lenses, there wasn't a lot of overlap. I realized that doing really successful environmental restoration wasn't having any positive impact on the community. We could bring back fish really successfully, but the community didn't benefit. So I decided to do kind of a mid-career master's. And I just finished my dissertation for the University of Edinburgh in urban strategies and design. And I wanted to figure out how to bridge these two interdisciplinary subjects by adapting to climate change and solutions that focus on connecting communities with open space that benefit both. My core belief is that uplifting people is integral to uplifting the environment. So with that, here's a little bit of my before and after because I just really like them. So this is the Lower American River where I worked before. You can see the dam at the top and then after. And I basically did this all the time. Like we'd find a big sandbar and then we'd make really successful fish habitat. And we'd find a big sandbar and make really successful fish habitat. And we were really successful. This is juvenile salmon swimming in our recently spawned beds. We increased juvenile fish from, hardly any to a whole bunch. And we increased reds from 0 to almost over 1,500. But again, the community wasn't benefiting. And we'd work up and down the river, which touched nearly every level of socioeconomic development. So there were rich areas, there are middle class areas, and there are poor areas. And the perspective of my group as restorationists was that in these areas, the people were always a bit of a burden, like, oh, we got to do outreach again. And I think that this group probably sees it really differently because you all seem really invigorated by outreach. And during my master's, I really read a lot of your documents and combed through the website, and you're doing incredible things. So thank you for providing that framework and foundation. And I like what you're doing, and I want to add to it through an urban design lens. So a little bit about health and well-being. Where water meets land, green space, there are unique benefits to the health and well-being for people. There's increased physical activity because people walk further along rivers and oceans, and they get more vitamin D, they're healthier. They also improve mental health. People who visit the coast have greater levels of stress reduction. And this is markedly different in studies than people who visit forests. Forests are great, parks are great, but there's something really special about coastlines and river access. It's also economically accessible to everyone. Data suggests that woodlands promote mental health, predominantly used by the middle class. You go there, you usually have to use private transportation to go there, and they're usually closer to those neighborhoods. But by contrast, blue spaces like the coast are used by all sectors of society. So it's a really leveler to invite people, especially from disadvantaged backgrounds, to the coast and make sure that they're getting these really important physical and mental health benefits. And it's a great way to reduce inequalities in mental health. And there's something just absolutely, I love this because I find it true in myself. Like, I like walking in forests, don't get me wrong. But when I'm walking along the coast, I could do it forever, it almost feels like, even when the sand, which is really, really hard to walk in. So finding ways to bring communities to the coast is beneficial to the community in their health and their well-being. And it can also benefit the coast through education and outreach. There could be a lot of give and take and push and pull that's really beneficial here. So my project was, how can transformative adaptation bridge disciplinary conversations between restoration and urban design? So I'm going to give you some of the examples that I came up with. This is Granton. It is a deprived community outside Edinburgh. It doesn't matter a lot where Granton is specifically. I think the characteristics that Granton has are probably common across the US and Europe. Used to be a pretty vital industrial area, has been neglected for quite some time, now trying to be revitalized by the government. And the revitalization conversation leaves a lot of intrigue there. And that's the perspective that I come at this with, is from an urban planner. These often come in as consultants, and they work for council areas, or they work for the government. And communities can have these ideas. And from my experience, urban planning is the goal of that is to take ideas from the community by understanding their history, by understanding their current interests, and then use them to develop placemaking in revitalization and focus on ways to give the current community, often poor, deprived folks, really great benefits while making room for redevelopment and trying to maybe fit in some more people or add some more commerce. So this map, you're looking at it, it's the Firth of Forth, and you can see the 5 meter contour here, the 2 meter contour, and the low tide line. And this blue area is sort of the area I could make design interventions within. This is the Granton Harbor, which is under one master plan, and this red area is under another master plan. And this yellow boundary is at risk from coastal flooding during climate change. And these are the beginnings of my framework. So thinking about oyster restoration using these subtidal species, which I like oysters, but I don't think they're very cute. They don't have a big wow factor for, oh, let's go look at the pandas. Like, no one really wants to say, oh, let's go look at the oysters if you're already living in a deprived community. But I wanted to find a way to make that link and address some of the problems from climate change. You all are experts on knowing the benefits of oyster restoration, so I'm just going to quickly gloss over them. Water quality, reduced flooding, huge ecosystem benefits. They're nature's construction workers, I think, and many others. But connecting them to the community, it can be kind of a task. And so I kind of built this framework, and you'll see education, which I know NORA has a big focus on, and I drew a lot from that in there, so I'm not going to touch on it too much here. But then thinking about these other 3 improvements and strategies to connect oysters to the environment. So there were some physical improvements, like creating constructed tide pools. Constructed tide pools, in my intense Google research, are fairly rare, but I don't think they should be. Tide pooling is really fun, especially in low-lying areas and areas with wide tide zones like Granton has. And when you construct a tide pool, you're adding to the ecosystem. And so you can allow people and make safe places for them to walk and children to play, to experience the Firth of Forth. There is a famous early urban planner, Kevin Lynch, from around the 1960s, where he basically came up with mental maps. And I think we all are fairly familiar with mental maps, where you think like, oh, well, how would I get to the store? And you draw kind of a map in your mind. And he decided there are about 4 categories of mental maps, and boundaries are a main one. And at the center of my argument here is moving the coast from a boundary to a different district. So changing it from a hard, fast wall that you would walk past, or a place that you would just sort of enjoy looking at, to something you interact with. So something that teaches you, something that's intriguing, something that's always changing, a district that is fun to visit. Like a fun district with coffee shops, you'd also go to the fun district with the ocean. And with that, you also maybe have a nature center, which has public toilets, a community space for off hours, and underwater video streaming for native oyster reefs, so you can kind of real time see it, local programming, and a living laboratory as feasible. And using biogenic building materials for all of that. And then community involvement, which is pretty easy through art, signs, nature walks. These are fairly predictable things. And then placemaking is one of the things I also really care about, and I think is often underrated, because I think placemaking can come off as really ham-handed. I think we've all been to places where we're like, oh, so this place used to really do farming, and it just like in your face agriculture, farming information all over the place. But I think there are a lot of soft touches approaches that can draw people and interest and curiosity, which I think is a really important step. And I think curiosity and being curious is also an act of hope these days. And when you're curious about the future, you're also maybe a little hopeful about the future, which I think we all need. So thinking about placemaking through mirror transect, which I'll talk about soon, themed play structures for kids, maybe Oyster themed, maybe subtitle themed, themed cycle racks, which you can involve local artists in making, public exercise equipment, and of course science. So these are just general hints around the area, suggesting that the coast is an area to draw you into. So thinking about placemaking, mirror transects, which are these dotted blue lines, and you can put them anywhere. The red spots are schools, and you can have them intersect with schools. And the idea here is that the subtitle area is really fascinating. There's a lot going on there. It's a huge area of wildlife. And you can draw a mirror from the subtitle area onto the land and do soft touches, approaches, maybe little signs, maybe light art saying, oh, at about this far into the ocean, this is sort of the what you'd find there. Describing these areas with art along paths deepens this connection, and it creates opportunities for feasible integration beyond the confines of the project, because it can be a really soft touch, like, oh, here's just a hint of this. It also creates safe walking paths if you do it well, and you can draw a school to the ocean along a spot where teachers can have places to stop and educate the students, or gather where the students are safe and already a little occupied while the group reconnects, and aligns them to the coast where they can do further learning. And they're also pretty cheap. Like, these types of treatments are relatively cost effective. And then doing some themed cycle racks, which Sacramento, where I was living before, had a whole bunch of them, and it was really fun, honestly. It was very cheap in the order of things, and it made the place a lot more fun to be in, and like everyone would go around and take pictures by the fun bicycles, and there's no reason you can't have a reef that's been turned into a bicycle rack, and that improves active transportation and encourages many other positive things. And then thinking about the physical improvements, again, you can have guided nature walks and constructed tide pools. building, inviting, and changing landscapes really encourages people to engage with them. And that's what I ultimately want. The more I think you engage with your landscape, the deeper your connection is to the place, the more likely you are to advocate and support restoring it and protecting it. So this ends up being a really cyclical idea where you have a place that's somewhat deprived or getting rejuvenated, and you're doing environmental restoration, and you want community support. So you invite the community to understand through place. And this place happens outside of the environmental restoration. This is not detracting from what you're doing out there or how you're building reefs, but you can, of course, involve school children in it, which I know a lot of the NORA community really does. And it's also economically equal, as I've said before. Exploring tide pools doesn't have an entry, a dollar entry. So you can, kids can go, everyone can go out and spend hours getting their vitamin D and improving their mental health and improving their activity and building a deeper relationship with the firth. And then thinking about a nature center, which is a big part, but it doesn't have to be. And it's really convenient for Granton that they had this historical building that the community wasn't quite sure what to do with. And I really think a nature center would be really perfect, which would provide an anchor for rewilding, allowing community members to see science up close, and allowing the science to happen in a specific area. You have a home base. And you could host local exhibits linking history, resiliency, and restoration. One of the things that I really love about oysters is how poetic they are as storytellers and how focused they are as historians. Their shells, as you know, are calcium carbonate, and they degrade really slowly and they grow like tree rings pretty slowly. So they're recording the history of this place, the water quality history, the water chemistry history, their whole time. And you can go out, as I did, and pick up oyster shells and think about what the conditions were during that oyster's growth. And you can do, of course, measurements and radiocarbon dating to find out all of these things. I read an article where someone did this and they could see Chernobyl explosion in the oyster shell because it picked up that water chemistry. And that was just amazing. And what a way to link the community to its history from this sessile creature. And I understand that you guys would be more experts than I, that thinking about how when you're thinking about where you choose to restore oysters, you often try and find places where oysters have been, which also means that their shells have been there. And thinking of oysters as storytellers is really poetic. And as we try and rebuild our environment, we can also rebuild our history with them and think about the lessons that they have. Anyway, I'm getting kind of a tangent, but I hope you see them with even more love than you already do. And nature centers can be a place where you go and explore this, right? And you get to grab a bunch of oyster shells. You can host field trips and then provides community space, meetings in the evenings. And the community space, to me, has two benefits. One, of course, it's great to have community space, but it's very passive also way to educate oysters. People are always showing up early, and when they're showing up, they'll have something to read, and they'll be deepening that connection to oysters and their environment and sort of passively engaging and learning and thinking more about protection. And then living breakwaters, I think, is a pretty key development where you can build oyster reefs, maybe starting with something inorganic, but then planting oysters there from your nursery as you go. And they provide a storm surge buffer and really improved environmental restoration benefits and biodiversity. And they also probably have a lot of fun camera experiences once they kind of get going, like, oh, look at the fish, or look at these oysters filter feeding as we do it. And being able to see it, bringing the underwater subtidal region again onto land in a way that benefits both, I think really has important success stories within it. And then so here's most of my treatments together. I didn't talk a lot about biogenic building materials, but a quick plug there. There is a company out there that licenses basically their design for concrete builders all over to have specialty biogenic riprap essentially that has nooks and crannies designed for species in your area. So you can have oyster-esque and other shellfish special nooks. So they have a really easy time hooking onto it and settling in, which is great and needed and improves the biodiversity there. And then nature walks, I think that that's all pretty straightforward. They could come from the community center or wherever else, but it's another way to have people maybe volunteer their time and learn about their environment and deepen the community connection. Community is somewhat of a nebulous word. When you really start thinking about it, there are bits that we talk about the community as one thing, like, oh, the community wants this, but who is the community and what do they want? It's a lot more complicated and nuanced than that. But providing guided nature walks and other places for the community to gather and become more cohesive and learn is really important to having a strong community voice. So places like guided nature walks and the nature center bring those together where it's a gathering space. And then thinking about sort of the effort and the impact associated with this, you know, some things that the effort is high and the impact is high, like living laboratory. I think it'll take a lot of effort to keep that going. And the nature center, that they were working with a building that they were already redeveloping. So it was a slightly lower effort, but public toilets take a lot of maintenance. On the other hand, things like cycle racks, nature walks, mirror transects, these soft, light touches that really start to draw the imagination and draw people towards the coast, pretty low effort and pretty high impact. You're sparking the imagination. And you're trying to increase environmental understanding, increase support from the community for restoration efforts. I think during some grant writing processes, you all would know best that they're like, oh, do you have any letters of support? And if you have one, a few from the community where like, we absolutely love this, please bring oyster restoration. I think that would be probably pretty powerful. And they absolutely improve the health and well-being for the community. So thinking about the cycle here of support from people supporting oysters and oysters supporting people through health and well-being, I think it makes my heart warm. These are some further resources I wanted to leave you with. Blue Health is a pan-European research initiative that investigates the links between blue spaces and climate and health. There, where I got a lot of the health and well-being information on the benefits of coastal and riverine environments. Seas, Ocean, and the Public Health Europe, SOFI 2020, also has a lot of great information. I also am happy to send you my whole report, which is quite long, or there's an abridged version up here, and feel free to contact me if you want to discuss this further. I'm happy to share my information, like take my ideas, have a go at it if it sparks or if it fits. I want to get this out there because I really do think that lifting the community, lifting people, and lifting the environment go hand in hand. And that is it for me.